Welcome everyone to this week's edition of the Kinder Institute Colloquium, bringing you the best in history and political thought that we have managed to arrange. Once again, we wish we were we are happy. We look forward to someday again being able to have our Pursuit of Happiness Hour sponsored by Logboat Brewing. But you can just look at the sticker back there, and afterward, and when this is over, anyone who's on this call is welcome to hang around and talk and chat more informally. Today we've got this is I think our 5th week in a row, and we're ranging around the world and arranging topics, and this one's a little bit closer to elections, but with this today we're going to hear about the rest of the Americas. So I'm really glad to have Hilda Sabato with us. Only other things I can think of to mention is next week we'll actually be not doing this next week because there's a Missouri Regional Seminar on Early American History, which you can look up if you're that's not a talk but a paper to read, and if you're interested in that, look it up on the website at democracymissouri.edu, and we can and you can write in and get an invite. Then after that, we'll be back and have on the next one of these will be on November 13th. Christina Bambrick of the University of Notre Dame with a political science talk, political thought talk, who's responsible for constitutional rights. And then we'll be back to the Caribbean, and then to Thomas Jefferson, or talking back to Thomas Jefferson on December 4th with Mia Bay of University of Pennsylvania. But that's enough coming attractions. Let's now turn it over. Let's now get today's event started, and to help facilitate today's discussion with Hilda Sabato, I would like to turn it over to a special guest, my colleague, associate professor of history and director of undergraduate studies, and our history department Latin Americanist specializing in South America, Professor Robert Smale, who's going to introduce Hilda and then lead the discussion after that. So thank you, Robert. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. And it is really my pleasure to be able to sort of guide this discussion today with Professor and historian Hilda Sabato. Hilda Sabato is a head researcher at the Consejo Nacional de Investigaciones Científicas y Técnicas, the National Scientific and Technical Research Council in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She is a former professor of history at the Universidad de Buenos Aires. Among her many books, 2 of those books that have been published in both English and Spanish, we have Agrarian Capitalism and the World Market, Buenos Aires in the Pastoral Age, which I believe was put out in English by the University of New Mexico Press in the United States, and then The Many and the Few, Political Participation in Republican Buenos Aires, put out by the University of Stanford Press. Now, the book that we are going to be talking about today is Republics of the New World, the Revolutionary Political Experiment in 19th Century Latin America. Now that I know that Professor Sabato probably considers this more of an essay than a book, but that word essay and that genre, an English language audience kind of has difficulty conceptualizing that, where a Latin American Spanish speaking audience would have a better idea doing it. So we'll just call it a book, even though Professor Sabato would probably call it more of an essay. And so what I want to also say is, I know that Professor Pasley and I have have read the book, and I believe that a number of graduate students who are at this talk today have also read the book. So what we're going to do is, this is a conversation. So as the conversation evolves, if you have a question, go ahead and put that question into the chat, and we will try to call you in and let you in to participate and ask Professor Sabato that question. Okay, thank you very much for joining us today, Professor Sabato. It's a pleasure having you here.
Yes. So thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I really thank Jeff for the opportunity to participate in your colloquium. And I thank Robert for his introduction. Also, all of you for being here, or where there, but here. Well, I will be happy to chat with you through this hour and a half or so.
Okay, thank you. Well, Professor Sabato, like I said, Professor Pasley and I have had a chance, had the pleasure of reading your book in preparation for this conversation, but many people who are here at this Zoom meeting today may not have had a chance to read it. Actually, many of them have, so that is going to be great. I was wondering if you could quickly describe, for those who maybe haven't had the chance to read the book yet, what are some of the main arguments you make about the politics of the period in Latin America between the 1820s and the 1870s?
Okay, I will try to do that in a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes or so. I hope I can manage. For those of you who have read the book, you know that the book starts with the transition from colonial rule to independence in the Spanish colonial territories. And this shift implied a radical political transformation, the creation of new political communities which did not replicate the old, neither in terms of territories and populations, nor in political organization. Actually, with the wars of independence, the colonial territorial map collapsed completely, and it took many decades to reach a relatively new, stable design. So there were many decades of, let's say, nation building until at the end of the 19th century, as you know, the present map almost was finally consolidated. This in the second half of the 19th century. Now, the early choice of the founding fathers to reject the values and institutions of the Ancien Regime and adopt popular sovereignty as the foundation for the new polities linked this region to the Atlantic revolutions and the process of political modernization underway. From then on, the political no longer referred to a transcendent instance like in the Ancien Regime, but was considered a human construct. Now, within that framework, two main regime options were available: the constitutional monarchy and the republic in the world at the time. At a time when most of the Western modern polities endorsed constitutional monarchy or, to court, absolutist monarchy, the Americas, with the sole exception of Brazil, opted for the republic. For you, this is common sense, but for us, for the Latin Americans and for those who watch Latin Americans, the notion that opting for the republic was a very bold step. The adoption of Republican formula tried on a vast scale was unparalleled outside the United States at the time. And it really opened up a decades-long history of what I call political experimentation. It was a bold step that entailed radical innovations in the way of instituting the polity, so that the transition filled the men involved with uncertainty. The vast Republican experiment in nation building that followed is actually the main topic of the book. In the road in the road of the Republic, the policies in the making show striking similarities in the norms, institutions, and practices they experimented at different periods during the century. From the beginning, the option introduced a deep break with the colonial era. That's my argument. For starters, the embracement of popular sovereignty required what Edmund Morgan has called the invention of the people, and demanded the definition and redefinition of the relationships between the people and government, and of the boundaries of inclusion in and exclusion from the polity. So politics at the time experienced a change in scale. Therefore, the people were at the center of the adventure of self-government, and they are also at the center of my book. The newly formed polities had to make operational the principle of popular sovereignty, a step that did not prove easy. Although early on in the century, all of them embraced representation and representative government, a rather recent political invention. They introduced not just the republic, but the representative republic, which does not necessarily come together, as you well know. This move implied that on the one side, the election of representatives by the people became the key procedure in the creation of authority and in the legitimation of political power. The people that elected the government were also in charge of exerting a regular control over it. And this is embedded in the notion of representation. It's not just choosing government, but controlling it. And this control rested mainly at the time in the hands of public opinion on the one side, on the other side, on the citizens in arms. Now, today we're familiar with the role of public opinion in our democracies, but armed citizenship is no longer mentioned as a valid means of keeping government in check. For most of the 19th century, however, it was an important aspect of republican regimes, and not only in Spanish America, by the way. The establishment of these and other mechanisms related to representative government involved a long history of experimentation. In all cases, this process brought about the mobilization of large sectors of the population and their incorporation in political life. The book explores the normative frameworks, institutions, and practices related to these three instances in the invention of the people: elections, public opinion, and armed citizenship in the form of militias, which offer a privileged point of entry to explore the politics of the age. These instances involved increasing number of men, and to a lesser extent women, who participated in the political life of these republics. For the most time, citizenship was widely extended among the male population and favored its incorporation into politics. To compete for and reach office, whether by violent or peaceful means, those who sought power had to involve the citizens. The few had to resort to the many. Yet Republican politics was not democratic in today's sense of the word. Participation was mainly channeled through networks that involved hierarchies and unequal relationships. Gradations of power and prestige did not refer mainly to social status, but rather to the political capital amassed by those in charge. At the same time, inclusion, albeit unequal, opened the way to active involvement of the many and their relative empowerment. Political networks engaged in collective forms of action cut across the social, ethnic, and cultural divides and shaped shared spaces of identification and belonging. I come now to my last point, briefly. 19th century Spanish American political life spelled conflict and faced dilemmas that were similar to those confronted by previous experiences in republicanism, such as early United States, as well as post-revolutionary France. Rivalries among the few and their followers animated a dynamic, often turbulent political life. During the best part of the century, governments were usually ephemeral, leaderships contested, territorial boundaries uncertain, and political regimes subject to successive changes. In my book, I argue that rather than flawed examples within the larger picture of modern republics, they may be read as deeply embedded in that tradition. Between the 1820s and the 1870s, the Spanish-American Republican political order was strongly shaped by a civic rhetoric that favored the participation of the members of the polity and resulted in a wide-ranging mobilization of different sectors of the population. At a time when the centralization of state power was a highly contested proposition everywhere, I mean in the Americas, political life was highly decentralized and conspired against any attempt at creating an overall hegemonic instance of domination, a central state. This institutional and political pattern resulted in recurrent instability, which was not the outcome of a failure to play the game of the Republic, but on the contrary, a result of a specific way of abiding by its rules. Uncertainty and instability were not exclusive to the Spanish-American world. And I like to share this with you, who are not Latin Americanists. Republican experiences in late 18th and 19th century Europe offer several examples of the difficulties in, in establishing and reproducing legitimate authority within that kind of regimes, which led to their demise. I mean, there were no Republican governments that lasted for long in Europe until the late 19th century. As we know, the United States, the most successful case, was not free from the same type of challenges, but arrived at different solutions. Spanish Americans, in turn, insisted on the initial basic patterns for 50 years, more or less. And although they also tried different ways to tame politics, it was only by the last decades of the century that they decidedly opted out of some of the former practices and embraced the tenets of the new order. My book ends precisely at that moment when the 19th century Republican experiment shifted gear, I would say, and entered into a new and different phase. So in a few words, this is the basic argument of the book, and now we can start to deal into more specific issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very concise yet thorough presentation of the arguments that you make in this book. And I want to go ahead and start with, a topic that might surprise many people in the United States when they look at Latin America in the time period that you're talking about. And you talk about elections as one of sort of the central practices of these Republican ideas and experiments in Latin America. And people might be surprised about your argument about how broad the franchise was during this time period and how open the elections were during this period to participation by members of the popular classes. I wonder if you could, how did that happen?
That's a key question. It was a key question when I started, because like most mortals, I thought that most mortals this side of the world, I thought the 19th century politics was something which excluded the many, and that was just managed by a few guys in a room who decided what was going to happen. And then when I had to, actually that was my first argument, so I was trying to look for alternative ways of participation. That was my first, many years ago, I started looking for alternative forms of participation. I discarded elections as something that didn't matter really. And then I started to realize that they did. As I started reading, going to the sources and working into these alternative ways of participation, I realized that they were completely tied to the formal ways of participation, and elections were at the heart of this. And then, of course, this was I was working on Argentina, but at the same time that I was working on Argentina, other people, other scholars, other colleagues in Brazil, in Mexico, in other countries were doing the same thing in their countries. And there was a whole literature now on elections in Latin America that show how far the 19th century was from this image that we had of politics being exclusively an upper class thing. When you start, first of all, it was the discussions on the franchise took place throughout the century. All the time there were discussions in Congress, on the press, etc., regarding who were the people supposed to vote, who were not supposed to vote, and so on and so forth. At the beginning, this means in the 20s, the revolutionary elites who started the process of nation building were very strongly in favor of opening up. They were very critical of the, let's say, of the raw material they had there, but at the same time, they thought that they had to incorporate. And this had I think that it had two main, there were two main reasons, there are two main reasons we can resort to explain it, but I think there are many other arguments that can be made. One is that this was a society that was at war. Mobilization was large, I mean, the whole, the decade between 1810 and 1820s was a decade of war, mobilization, people going and coming from all, in armies, different sorts of armies, formal armies, informal armies, guerrillas, and so on. And therefore, it was a traumatic moment in the sense for a social order. The social order could not hold, and therefore there was a lot of popular participation in the armies. And this mobilized people, and people were mobilized and had to be channeled into formal ways of participation if they wanted to recover some sort of social order in this policies in the making. They were not really nations yet. That's one thing. But the other thing, which I think we have to take into account, is ideology. I mean, these revolutionary elites were very, I would say, radical in their republicanism. And I must say that republicanism and the republic did not come as a matter of fact. There was a struggle among the elites between those who were in favor of the constitutional monarchy and those who were in favor of the republic and of different sorts of republics. So those who won, and this was a political struggle, it was not just a problem of exchange of niceties or theory, those who won were actually the most avant-garde in that sense, those who wanted to look and incorporate the new sectors. And at the time, this meant an initial drive towards a broad citizenship, male, always male. Now, this changed in the decades that followed, especially in the 30s and the 30s, particularly in the 30s. There was a drawback. There was some sort of the results were not what they wanted, and so there was a new wave, a more conservative wave, and there were some attempts at restricting the franchise and introducing clauses that would restrict the franchise, mostly on grounds of literacy, and of inclusion, let's say, material well-being, but it was almost always short-lived. And again, in the 50s, as you know, most of these policies opened up even more their franchise until the end of the century. And it is at the end of the century that these changes again. So I think there were both practical considerations in this, that is, we have to include these people who are already mobilized, and there was and an ideological side to it. which said, well, we want this. Also, you know, citizenship in these countries was not based on the Anglo-Saxon model. It was more like the French, and this, in the sense that the notion of property owners was not important, while the notion of autonomy was crucial. The citizen had to be an autonomous being, had to be a person who did not depend on other person in order to be able to vote. And that's why slaves were not included, but yes, free black, or indigenous population was included, but servants were not at the beginning. Later on, this expanded. So these are the main considerations for the Franchise at the time.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I found it fascinating in your section on elections, you actually mentioned that we have this image of the few in a back room somewhere deciding, in elections being rather irrelevant. But then you also point out that the few, those who were members of the dominant classes, those who were the ones who were generally at the top politically, most of them never even bothered to vote. The voting process was done by those lower down than we might call the political leadership. That the wealthy, the powerful, the political leadership didn't actually vote in these elections. So,
but you know, this is something I forgot to mention before, but one thing we have to take into account when we study this period is that it is in politics, as you know, and you're going to vote in a few days, so you know that a short time is a long time. I mean, things change rapidly and may change, hopefully may change rapidly, but so that what you see especially in situations like this years after independence, where everything was being experimented, experienced, there was a lot of change, a lot of innovation, but innovations came also resulted from what the actual actors felt that was happening. So they were observing the results of their own measures and changing as they went along. So for example, once that once that you had a broad franchise and you had incorporated people into elections, they became indispensable, because the ways in which elections were held and were run and were organized meant that those who wanted to win learned how to create machines, what we call electoral machines, build up networks, which then became the main instrument for those who wanted to win. But if they wanted to win, they needed to mobilize. So it was like a circle. You know, at the beginning, people did not. Voting is not something you are born with. So when at the beginning in the 1820s and 30s and 40s, people did not go to vote. I mean, they didn't even meet many of those citizens that could vote did not go to elections. They had to be mobilized. They had to be recruited, and they entered into this sort of political machines, which were not a one-way top-down organizations. They were organized by people at the top, and especially in the intermediate echelons, but they implied inclusion, and they implied something coming from the bottom up as well. And this, once you establish this, then it's very interesting to see how political leaders who were terribly critical of what was happening in elections, with people, there was a lot of ritual violence, there was a lot of manipulation in a sense, or whatnot. They were very critical, but at the same time, they used that in order to win. So it's a double discourse, so to speak. They say, oh, this is terrible, this is not uncivilized, but what can we do? They said that on the newspaper, and then they went to their party headquarters and organized these things so that people would go and vote. So elections were generally, and you have these descriptions of elections in the United States, which are very similar in the 19th century, when you have, barbecues, and you have people coming in, there partied, and there was drink, and there was whatnot. And then this became part of a ritualized, which was important. And as today, we have other rituals, which also are important.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and ask Tyrone to unmute here a second, because he had a question that I think relates to what we were talking about, which is sort of the percentages of people participating in elections. Tyrone, Go ahead.
Hi. So we had to read your book for class a few weeks ago. One of the standout things for me on the kind of elections chapter, which I'm now on, is how you said how only between 2 and 5% of the people ever actually voted. So I was wondering if you could go into a bit more detail about that. Because I know you then said that even of these 5%, they came from a wide variety of social classes. But why was it that, if they were so included, that they simply decided not to vote at all? And does this have any ramifications for to what extent popular sovereignty was embodied in these republics?
Well, yes. First of all, there's a change throughout. One important thing is elections. This is not a process in which you begin with a few voters and then more and more you get more voters through the century. Elections could bring two elections in a row. In one, you could have many people participating, and in the next, you wouldn't. And this talks about what an election meant. It was not something that happened spontaneously. It was not people, individuals, as we think of them today, staying at home and chatting in the family and saying, who are you going to vote tomorrow, right? This was, elections happened because there was a very tight organization that led them to happen. In fact, it was not that people, as I said before, gleefully would go into a voting to the polls. They had to be convinced, this way of convincing was not just telling them this is going to be a great guy. They had to be organized. They were militants. So those who went to elections belonged to a network. It was not something that happened, individuals just dropping by. And this meant, and that's why what you have is, you have a franchise which is wide. Among those who were allowed to vote, who had the right to vote, of course, you have a higher participation than those numbers that you mentioned, 2 to 5% of the total population. And this happens at the time all over the place. It's not just Latin America, Spanish America. If you go to the numbers in England, in some parts of the United States, you have the same percentages of the total population. Remember that if you think of the total population at the time, young people, children, and teenagers and so on made a great part of the population. Women made, of course, half of the population. So those are out. So of the males, then you have adult males form a smaller part of the population in that sense. But of those who were franchised, you get elections where you have 50% of the people going to vote, and you get elections in the same year maybe where you have, I don't know, 15%. And that has to do with what was at stake. Who was competing with whom? Was there any chance of those who competed to win, and therefore they mobilized more? And sometimes they knew the election was going to be lost, so they didn't bother. So it's interesting because you have to think, the first thing you have to think when you think of these elections is change your frame of mind. Don't compare them to what you have now. But they are politically significant, not only because of what you accomplish with that, in the sense that you get you legitimate power through elections, but also because of those who participated. They could be few in terms of numbers, but they were relevant. And what is interesting also is that those few did not come mainly from the middle or upper classes. They came mainly from the lower classes. So that means they also had something at stake, that not only, they were not just pawns, they were not just manipulated to go there, they were actors. Although they might be subordinate actors, but they were actors.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and ask Nicanor now to go ahead and unmute, because he had a question about a major figure that is often touted in the historiography of 19th century Latin America. Nicanor?
Okay. Hi, Hilda. I'm from Argentina. I'm a student of history in the university in the city of Mar del Plata. And I read a lot of books from you. So thank you very much to write them. And I want to ask you, how will you explain the importance of the figure of the caudillo, the caudillo, for the stability in the century and in the context of conformation of these new nations?
Okay, well, caudillos, are sort of, I would say, a word that's been used to explain Latin America in a very, I would say, simple way, right? This was a region where caudillos reigned supreme. Mostly they were warlords that controlled a certain territory, and they had their following of people, and through armed power and through their own personal relationships with their clientele or their followers, they controlled the politics of the area. Now, this image of caudillos, which I have even simplified even more than what the literature generally does, has been now criticized, from very, very highly criticized, and there are interesting studies that show that the caudillos were not this very simple caricature of a, I don't know, the patron of a warlord, but that they were strongly embedded in institutional networks of these republics in the making. And you can see that, of course, you have figures of caudillos who are who amassed a lot of power in certain areas of Latin America, but they are not just that. I mean, they have, and they work, and they build their power within the institutions of their republic, right? They also had to win elections. They also had to deal with their I don't know, legislatures. In the case of Argentina, the legislatures in the provinces. They also had to, in a way, be accountable for what they were doing somehow. Now, the situation of war, the wars of independence, empowered many men who were not really, who were able, let me put it this way, who were able to recruit people, and to men also, and to lead certain political movements within these countries. And of course, the control of armed forces was a very important asset in this power that they had amassed. But they were not just on the loose. They were not just people who could themselves do whatever they wanted to do and reign supreme in their own regions. There were controls. They had connections with institutions. They were institutionally embedded, some of them more than others. But this is something which changes a bit the notion of these sort of owners of a regions that could do, I don't know, could do whatever they wanted to do. So there's a lot of literature on that now.
Well, we have another question in here that actually relates, and let's continue this conversation about the relationship between leaders and the more common people, their followers, the rank and file. Let me bring Reeve in. Reeve, go ahead. Do you want to share your question?
Yes. Please excuse me, my mouth is full.
See, that's the
Fascinating.
danger.
That's unfair. That's
The
unfair.
danger of having your screen dark.
Really enjoying your talk, and look forward to reading your book. My question, I wanted to pick up on your comment that said that made the good, sort of a sensible point that that these political machines that that political leaders built were, that they were shot through with reciprocal influence, that the rank and file had a certain kind of influence as well as the other. And I just wanted you to speak a little bit more about that. And I'm particularly interested in what areas the rank and file had influence over. Is it about, was it about policy? Was it about sort of the distribution of resources? Was it about recognition of their cultural or political value, things like that?
No. None of that and all of that. Let me see. Now, a little bit of all. Now, the reason why I insist this is an essay, going back to Robert's first introduction, is because it's an interpretation of a vast piece of history, right? So there's some sort of, you have to resign some differences in order to find what's common in all this, in this whole area, which is very heterogeneous from a social, cultural, and political point of view. So I try to mention this here and there in the book with different examples, but in relation to what you're bringing up, it depends very much on the setting. Urban politics is much more elaborate than rural politics. And so in urban settings, you have very elaborate, and it also depends on the period, right? Let's say from the 50s onward, urban politics is quite elaborate, especially where there are big cities like Buenos Aires, Mexico, Bogota, and so on. And there you find political machines that are very, they're really, if you look at them in detail, there's continuous exchanges within this, and also because you don't have actually the metaphor of the many and the few is eloquent, but at the same time is a little bit misleading, because between the few and the many, there are many in the middle. There are quite a few in the middle, and these intermediaries, these brokers, are key. They're key figures. They're the ones who recruit the people. They're the ones who represent. They communicate the leaders higher up with the masses. They actually articulate the whole system. And in this articulation, there's things that come and go. And so you may have, for example, in the 50s in Santiago de Chile, in Lima, in Cordoba, in Argentina, in Mexico, you have, for example, a very strong movement of liberal so-called liberal democratic politicians who are in touch and work with a group of artisans. Artisans become sort of a model of what a worker should be for these groups. And therefore, they try to recruit actual artisans, not just the figure of the artisans. And there is a strong movement towards incorporation of these sort of what we would call later on the labor aristocracy or something like that. And these people come and they're very, very, very clear what they want in these exchanges. And they include policies, they include issues, they include ideas. But then you have on the other extreme, you may have in rural areas in Chile where the relationship, the patron-client relationship is quite strong. Then you have there a more traditional clientelistic sort of link. Then you have, for example, the other, a very different type of construction is thus in Peru, you can find in the relationship between the parties and the indigenous communities. And there you find people, indigenous groups that negotiate their participation in Republican politics with very specific claims. And they join the armies, the Republican of different conservatives or liberals or whatever the name might be at the time, according to what they might have achieved in their negotiations. So it's a very explicit thing, or it's a very immaterial way of looking at it, but so you have all the shades there. But I think, I'm convinced after looking at many examples, there's a lot to do yet, because in many countries you have no studies of this, no research. But what we have shows that you have a great diversity in this sense. But what I found less and less is any sign of complete, let's say, dependence, of people just going because they are forced to do this. There might be, probably there are, but that's not at all the majority of examples.
Okay. Well, now I'm going to go ahead and ask Adriana to come in, because she has a very specific question about Argentina in the 19th century.
Thank you. I was just writing my.
Turn on your camera. There we go.
Oh, she's muted.
Yeah.
There. No, you're mute. The microphone.
Okay. No, I have about 2 or 3 questions, so I don't know which one to start, but I'd like to follow up on what Nicanor said about caudillos. Because as a literary scholar, of course, I teach Sarmiento in all my 19th century Spanish American literature classes. And of course, that's the view that we get of Rosa. So I'm wondering, from the perspective that you're bringing to the history of 19th century Spanish America, then is there new light being shed on a figure like Rosas?
Yes, indeed. I mean, if one person is not the figure of the caudillo that you see in the classic literature on the topic, is Rosas. He's a highly sophisticated man who has established a very elaborate political machine to win elections. Rosas held elections every year for the legislature. And he managed to create his own list of candidates, which was the only one available because others who were on the opposition were persecuted. He was an authoritarian man, but his regime was authoritarian, but he did not miss any elections, and he made a point of mobilizing the voters who had to vote for his men, for his list. But this implied a very elaborate relationship with jueces de paz, with all the intermediate brokers of the system, and a very complicated comings and goings with the legislature. You know, the history of his dealings, the dealings between the legislature and Rosas. You know, he was the governor of Buenos Aires. He had nothing. He was not the president of Argentina. He was the governor of Buenos Aires. There was no Argentina then. So he was the governor of the main province in the country, and he had in this sense, he's the best example of of a republic, a very traditional Republican leader, because he had his militias and he had, of course, public opinion. He worked hard to devise his own media, his own newspapers, and so on. So the whole institutional setup was there. How he managed that, and whether he accepted that was a free choice system or not, that's a different point. But republicanism does not exclude, as you know, dictatorship. So, and Rosa, there's a lot of written on Rosas now. There's a wonderful book that it's an old book now, but has a couple of decades, that I recommend to you in this sense. That is Jorge Mayer's book, which deals on the Republican discourse of Rosas.
Interesting.
So he was a caudillo in the sense that he was a military. He was not originally a military guy, but he was the head of the militias of Buenos Aires and so on. But then he was basically a statesman, really. There were other caudillos in Argentina, like Chacho Peñalosa, or who were more primitive in a sense, in the sense that they were not so well established in an institutional network, but nevertheless they acted as men who were in the system. They were accused of being rebels, but they acted the way it was within the system.
Excellent. I want to go ahead and ask Claire now to please go ahead and share her question with the group.
Hi, thank you so much for being with us today. We read your book a few weeks ago in class, and one of the things we discussed was just how you mentioned that women were often excluded from voting and from political organizations, with the exception, I think you include in the book, of philanthropic societies. And I was curious, what were some of the alternative forms of political participation that women were engaged in during that time?
Yeah, well, first, again, there's a change throughout this period, right? Women were not allowed to vote. But they did take part, and we know this from memoirs and chronicles and so on. We know that they were active within the home, in politics, in trying to influence. They were active in tertulias, which are like the salons in France. So the upper class women had ways to have their voice heard. Then there was, I think, besides this, I do think that the main way which women participated was in the public sphere. That is, trying to influence public opinion. The lettered women, through some of them, did have a participation in newspapers and so on, few, but they were there. But there was also, women are also always visible when you have demonstrations in the streets. And these demonstrations how do you call them? Basically, when there was all this display of, which was highly, very, 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 very common in, especially in urban politics, the display of peoples in the streets, right? Also very organized, and so this, in this case, not by the political, or not necessarily by the political parties, but by the civic associations. There were many civic associations in cities like Mexico, or Lima, or Buenos Aires, or Santiago, or Bogota. You had, by the, especially in the second half of the 19th century, hundreds of civic associations of all different sorts, mainly led by men, but this did not exclude women, and particularly they did not exclude women in public activities. They might exclude them from the leadership and so on, but they had a presence. And so when you read about demonstrations in the streets, marches, all these things, you see women there. I mean, they are described. We have the women, or they would, from the windows of their homes, they threw flowers to the men that were marching below. And there was this sort of incidents. At the same time, if you go, this is more complicated because there's not much literature on this, but there is some, armies and militia and so on. When there was a war, women were always there. Armies march and be after, I mean, you have the men coming marching, and then the women came, women and children who went with the armies, regular or irregular, particularly the irregular armies, but also the regular armies. So, and because this is a century in which there are many internal wars besides the big wars, you have that women had this sort of influence in the field, so to speak.
Well, I want to go ahead and ask the Kinder Institute residential college students if they wanted to go ahead and share their question with the with Professor Sabato.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Galvin. I'm one of the graduate students in the room tonight with the Kinder Residential College. We were wondering, as a group, what role that the Catholic Church and its institutions may have played in the civic culture of some of these republics.
That's a very good question. And in the sense that in the book, I say very little about the Catholic Church. I should have said more, but well, it's not my piece of cake, the Catholic Church. But anyway, I must say that the Catholic Church, let's say the Catholic ideology had a very strong influence in, let's say, in the Republican culture. You know, there was the Republican, in the early Republican culture. And the church had a very strong role, not the church, within the church, sectors of the church were very active in the independence war, both for the Spaniards, but also for the rebels. And you know that the sermons in churches were one of the main ways through which the revolutionary leaders got through to the people, to the lower classes. It was a priests that had sermons every week, and there were what called patriotic catecisms that were the priests had to or did teach their followers, their followers. So the priests had a key role, active role, as leader in the leadership. They also were leaders in political parties throughout the period, and not necessarily in the Conservative Party. I mean, the Conservative Party had in those countries where there was a Conservative Party. Argentina did not have a Conservative Party, but Mexico, for example, they were strongly tied to the church, and to the church and the conservatives were shared ideology, shared interests, and so on and so forth. But there were also liberal priests, and there was also a section of the church that worked together with other parties. So the church was there in many ways, in many ways. In the civic culture, which was your question, they had a strong, they were important at the beginning because, of course, most of the sociability of the early period, of the colonial period, had to do with the church. The church had the philanthropic organizations, they had the cofradías, the brotherhoods that were mostly church brotherhoods. And this continued after independence. Brotherhoods were important throughout the century. But of course, in the face of the expansion of lay organizations, they became less and less important in devising or in influencing the civic culture of these countries. Now, the press is another area where the church had always a place. I mean, they had, most countries had one or two or maybe more newspapers that responded directly to the church or to the church authorities, right? But they were not, I don't think they were hegemonic anywhere. Even in Mexico, well, in Mexico in the end there was a war to curb the power of the conservatives, which were very, very close to the church, and they lost. I mean, the church, the conservatives lost. And the Ley de Reformas, which followed in the late 1860s, had to do with this empowerment of the liberals in the face of the defeat of the conservatives. And this was a war. I mean, it was not just, again, it was not just voting, it was material confrontation through war. But in Colombia, it was more negotiated, the relationship between the church and the sectors that were more close to the conservative side of the church and the rest. But I don't think anywhere they reached a position of true hegemony in political matters.
Great. Let me go ahead and ask TJ Hall to now join us. And he has a question that takes us to a more ideological level. TJ.
Yes, I was kind of curious about like the ideological heritage of republicanism in Latin America. So did their justifications for like having republics over, say, constitutional monarchies, did those come from any specific thinkers or thinkers from a specific region, or was it maybe original to Latin America?
Well, the main influence when there was this choice for republics, I think it had to do with the notion that this was the radical thing to do. This was, in the case of the revolutionary leaders, they were initially very much in favor of more radical measures, and they were looking at the world and seeing what was the avant-garde, the Atlantic world. They saw the French Revolution. There was also the, let's say, the dangers of going too far, and Haiti, of course, the Asian Revolution, and the aftermath of the French Revolution was also something they wanted to avoid. But beyond this very extreme case, what they considered extreme cases, they embraced versions that were quite, let's say, avant-garde of what was going on in Europe and the United States. The United States was an example, always. I mean, because this was the only republic that really lasted. The French went down, the Spanish never became republican. Even later on, I mean, the Dutch had gone also down early on. So so the United States was always a reference. The French thinkers were a reference, and there you had the whole range of thinkers, and you had for all choices. I mean, there were Latin Americans who were more conservatives, and therefore they looked with greater admiration to people to the French of the 30s, right? And there were others who were more radical. So there was the whole array there that they could choose. And there was, and in what you see in Latin America, and those who do intellectual history have done a lot of work on this, is how there was, you could find in the Latin American intellectual milieus, you could find the whole range also. I mean, you have those who, and you had, and they also changed through time. For example, it's well known how Simon Bolivar changed his ideas at the beginning, and then he became more conservative in a sense, or what we would call conservative. This is completely using our language, but anyway, so that you understand. So there was a whole range, and they picked up from and very much like we also do in the intellectual world today. They picked up from different sources. So this was, except for those thinkers or intellectuals who were very, very systematic, mostly in the political world, what happened was that they picked up different things from different thinkers and made their own concoction, so to speak. And you had, of course, in Latin America, very good intellectuals that would propose their own ideas, but they were always in dialogue with what was going on elsewhere. Also, the Spanish liberalism, the Spanish liberals of the 20s and 30s had a very strong influence in Latin America. I mean, their ideas. So this was I would say that they did not copy, cut and copy. They did not imitate, mostly. They did not try to replicate. They adopted and adapted whatever they was, and they were very aware of what was going on elsewhere, and very critical of some of the things that were going on elsewhere. So they were, I mean the intellectuals of Latin America. When I say they, I mean them, right? The thinkers, the political thinkers, what they call at the time the publicists, the publicistas, those who wrote in the newspapers, wrote books, and had a tight relationship with politics, because at the time, the political world and the world of the publicistas was tightly connected. There was not a political class and an intellectual world completely separate like we have mostly today, but this was a very smaller world of people who influenced each other. So you have and of course there was also they resorted also to the classical examples. And for example, going back to Rosas, he used all the time examples of Rome. Rome was a reference, Republican Rome, traditional republicanism, right? Less so Greece, but Rome was always a presence in not only in the case of Rosas, but in all the literature of Latin America. You would see all these men talking, even in Congress and so on, and mentioning and citing all the big names of Roman, also basically of the Roman republicanism, classic republicanism. So they included in the 30s, for example, the influence of the French doctrinaires was key. And that's when they introduced some of the limitations to voting, because they were inspired by the French doctrinaires and who had done that in France, and then they went back. But I don't know if I answered your question. But
okay. Well, I know that they have already talked before, but I think it's a great follow-up question to TJ's question. And so I'm going to ask Reeve to join us one more time and sort of share that follow-up question.
If he's finished with his sandwich.
Yeah.
I am. My mouth is clear, and I'm still very much enjoying this talk.
Yes.
My question is whether the influence also went the other way, whether any of the Latin American republics or there had an influence over the broader, Atlantic body of Republican thought. And if they didn't, how did Latin American leaders and intellectuals feel about that?
I don't know. I don't know how they felt. I know some of them, I mean, I don't know very much about that to answer your question properly, but my feeling is that they, of course, Latin America was at that time, Spanish America was a rather secondary place in the world, so hopefully secondary and maybe third, I don't know, a backwater, I don't know. But nevertheless, I must say that some of the big names in Latin America, politicians and intellectuals of Latin America did have connections with intellectuals in Europe and in the United States. They corresponded with them. They visited Europe, and also you get some Europeans coming to Latin America. So there was some sort of exchange there, but I don't think, well, maybe the examples did go backwards, go the other way, but remember that Europe, by the time these countries became explicitly republics, there was not one republic left in Europe. The only republic was the United States. So rather they probably were, and I read something about this somewhere, I don't remember where, probably they were generally examples used against going back to any Republican adventure. I mean, Latin America, not Latin America because Brazil was a monarchy, but Spanish America was a bad example because they were always, they were unstable. They were so unstable as the Europeans had been, but instead of going the right way and choose to go to a monarchic regime, they stick to the republic. They were very stubborn. They never went. I mean, if you see the history of the 19th century, all these countries come and go. You know, they adopt the republic, they cannot tame it. They go back to a monarchy, even at the end, I mean, until the 1870s in France, only the 1871. After 1771, you get the Third French Republic, which is a different republic already. I mean, it's already the tamed republic. You get the Italians who cannot hold the republic, the Spanish who have the experience of the 60s, and it lasted only a couple of years. I don't even think they reached a couple of years. So what you have is the United States. And what do you find in the United States? The worst war of the continent in the 1860s. So mind you, I mean, the United States was not an example of stability. It was more stable in the beginning than the Latin American country, the Spanish American countries. But when they decided to fight, by jolly, I mean, that was a fight. And this had a strong impact in Latin America, the Civil War, because it was a civil war. And it was the militias of the South that became this army of the South. So they had a lot, that war had, in terms, formal terms, institutional terms, a lot to do with the way in which these institutions work, these Republican institutions work, and the capacity of Lincoln at one point to decide that it was the opportunity to strengthen the power of the national state was what made a difference. Because this is also important. Most of these republics, if they were federal republics like Mexico and Argentina, they were very decentralized. They had the same type of organization as the United States, and therefore the states, the provinces, what we call the provinces, the states, were very strong. And it was very hard to control these states.
Okay, great. Now I think he's chomping at the bit. Let's go ahead and give Professor Jay Sexton an opportunity to ask a question.
Oh, no, I've enjoyed listening to this, and Hilda, I wanted to say that we really enjoyed reading the book in class.
Thank
We
you.
had a great discussion, and that's a product of a great book, and it's very clear, even for those who didn't know a whole lot about Latin American politics. I mean, it's structurally, it's so clear. And on the caudillo, the line that I shall remember from the book is towards the end, you say that all caudillo were politicians, but not all politicians were caudillo. And I thought that really summed it up in an interesting way. My question's about the sort of end chronologically, when you get to the later bits of the 19th century, and this kind of vibrant but volatile world of civic institutions and Republican practices kind of gives way, doesn't it, to the centralization of power, the consolidation of power. The militias give way to the standing armies, and you get something like Diaz in Mexico. And I'm wondering how you explained that shift, as it were. And my hypothesis for you is that to understand that bit at the tail end of the 19th century, one really needs to focus on the changing international environment. And one needs to think about how power is consolidated, because you have wars in this period. You talked about the French. Those internal divisions get really dangerous when you have foreign powers seeking to ally with one faction or the other. And that's how these civil wars become internationalized. And of course, you have wars between the republics themselves, like the War of the Pacific. So power's getting consolidated, and it's perhaps not surprising that the story changes. And if that's the case, I wonder if when we look back at that early bit of the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, if we could also say that it's a product of a very particular geopolitical habitat, of Spanish decline, of French weakness in the New World, and of a British Empire that, though kind of menacing, and I know in Buenos Aires, the British Empire looks a little bit more menacing than elsewhere, but by and large, the British are sheltering the new republics from foreign intervention. So I guess my question is, how does the kind of international environment fit in to your story about the internal institutions and practices?
Yeah, well, it does indeed. Although I do think that if we follow this argument to its a bit more, then you would say that it was impossible that this area became, this polities, whatever you want to call them, became republics in the 1820s. That was a very bad moment to become a republic. I mean, internationally, when Argentina's independence was in 1816, and there was a huge discussion in the Congress in Buenos Aires, because there was a lot of pressure to declare a constitutional monarchy, because it was the only way in which we could, they said, in which we could survive. And they lost. I mean, this position lost politically. It is true that later on in the 20s, things have changed a little bit, but nevertheless, still, you had an international, the international atmosphere was not very much pro-republic then, rather the contrary. So I don't think that is determinant. But having said this, I go back and say, yes, I think you're right in the sense that by the 1880s, 1890s, the world has really changed, and the position of these countries in the world has changed. If you look at, they have become, especially the larger countries, they become deeply embedded in the international market. They have increasingly become aware that they need that's their future in terms of getting some sort of place in the world. It's improve their economies. They all are becoming capitalistic, strongly capitalistic. They're selling to the international market. They need order, they need capital. To bring in capital, they need internal order. Capital is not going to come if you have everyday revolution. So I think that those are the structural factors that I think have an enormous influence in pushing towards the solution that is finally found. But I also think that within the elites, there's also an ideological change, and positivism has enormous influence in Latin America. And positivism talks about other things than republicanism. It doesn't believe in participation. It doesn't believe in la vita activa, as they would say in Republican jargon, right? And so it's the notion that individuals have to work. And you can find incredible speeches on the part of politicians at the end of the 1880s, 1890s, saying, well, the age of the revolution, of the participation in the streets is over. You have to seek your personal happiness through economic interest. You have to go work and find your own individual well-being, and then participate in elections when you're called to that end. So there's a change in the notion of what an ideal policy looks like. Now, so I do think the international changes have a lot to do. I mean, the power, the balance of power, international balance of power, the position of the big countries. But I think there are lots of things that come together to push forward in this direction. But let me say this is not the end of the story. I had to end the book somewhere. But the end of the story does not come there, because there are people who are against this model.
Sure.
There are political, ideological trends within these countries that are going to start questioning the new direction, not necessarily because they want to go back to republicanism, but because they want to go to other things. And that's when socialism comes in many of these countries, in the sense that political proposals on the part of socialism, on the part of more radical liberals. So what you have there is a new arena in which politics changes. As I say, the republic changes gear in the sense that there's a very strong attempt to tame politics, and they take measures like the ending with the militia, and in some countries like Peru, restricting the vote, or domesticating, taming the parties, and so on. There's a different notion of representation that comes to the fore, but this is not going to be a stable solution. This also is going to be contested in the future years, and then you have things like the Mexican Revolution in 1910, which again brings down an order that had seemed very solid. But what I found interesting, and I don't have a value judgment on what the republic looked like at the beginning and then how it changed. I just want to show that these things are these polities and these political regimes and these political inclinations are alive and they are changing all the time, right? And you have a certain point between the 1820s and the 1870s, something that somehow is shared by most. And then you have a regime that looks like something which I have called a Republican regime. And then you have this, at the end, changes. And it changes towards a taming of politics, but this taming of politics in the end will bring a reaction that does not come from nostalgic republicanism, but from something different that looks ahead. And I think that has to do with mass democracy, which is something you cannot talk about. I mean, that is irrelevant to think of in the 19th century.
Okay. Well, I think we have time for one more question, and Jeff Pasley has been very patient throughout, even though he is one of our hosts. So we'll go ahead and go to Jeff for the final question.
Well, just briefly, because I think we're definitely running out of time. So Hilda, I wanted to ask about your concept in the book of armed citizenship.
Oh yeah.
Because that's something that the U.S. absolutely has as well, and you alluded to the reason why it's at some point it kind of becomes the opposite. Being armed becomes a little bit. You can have a citizen soldier, but the experience with armed citizenship, as you said, led to one of the worst civil wars anyone ever had. Directly because you have and like this is actually like in one of the earliest kind of battles of the war, even before has to do with militias in St. Louis, with a German militia seizing a bunch of Southern militia in St. Louis. So I guess I just wonder if you could talk about the evolution of that and at what point that becomes how that fits in. You kind of treat it, and I think you're right, because I've saw it too, as part of their kind of Republican toolbox or their political toolbox. But if you could talk about how the history of that and how that evolves, if it does.
Yeah, well, let me say first that the militia was also a colonial institution. The Spanish had militia. It didn't in a different ideological framework. Militias were the army of vecinos, of local armies that were supposed to take care of local defense needs. But there was a tradition of militias within Spanish America dating back to colonial times. Now, this, I think, was it was turned around by the Republican ideology, in the sense that it became, the notion of armed citizenship became key, although it was never it was never an individual. I mean, the armed citizenship was a right. The right to bear arms was a right, but it was never considered individually. It was also always linked to the institution of the militia. So individuals became could bear arms. They had the right to bear arms, but they did not go around with their arms to their houses. I mean, this right was connected to a very specific institution, the militia, and later on the National Guard, which is the militia extended to when it's not just a local institution, but a more national, considered more national. And it was linked, and the idea was that a militia or armed citizenship was the best way to defend a country. And this goes back to Greece. I mean, you can trace it all through the Republican Western tradition, where the notion that an army, and of course in the States, this was very strong in the United States, the notion that a standard army or a national army or a state army was dangerous for not only for the people, but also in the case of the United States, for the states, right? It was a federal army was a dangerous instrument. It was also subject to corruption, and it could be tied to despotism or tyranny and so on. And this is a very long tradition. So this was picked up in the case of Spanish America. This long Republican tradition was revived, and there was throughout the century this discussion, an ongoing discussion, whether we want militias or we want standing armies. We want militias or we want standing armies. In the end, most of the time they had half and half. I mean, a bit of each. In some places, militia, and some periods, militias were stronger than the standing army. In some periods, it was the other way around. So it was a problem of principle and of practices also. In countries like Argentina or Mexico, it was like the United States. The militias were tied to the provinces, to the provincial autonomy, to defending themselves from the federal government, besides the individual right of controlling power. But all in all, they were linked to the notion that they were the, let's say, they were the best way to keep an eye on government, to control the tendencies toward despotism. So in practice, at the same time, they were strongly linked to local power. And this is also very important, because then militias were embedded in the local webs of power. And they really were an instrument of what we were mentioning before, caudillos, no, right? Quote unquote, but anyway, of local leaderships that always conspired against centralization of power. And they were also the main actors in revolutions, in levantamientos. The book describes the way in which levantamientos were a constant feature in most countries. And these levantamientos were always made on the name of freedom against despotism. We are against the despots. The despot is the guy who has power and who is exerting this power way beyond the rule of law. This could be true or not true, it doesn't matter, but it was used as a tool. And as a tool, it had legitimacy. It was not considered illegitimate. Also, it was not considered necessarily desirable, but once the government or those in power went well beyond their limits, then it was justified. And you had to justify. That's why most revolutions came with a declaration, a pronunciamiento, they say in Mexico. It was a declaration that explained why they were rebelling against so-and-so. So this is a part of a culture, of a political culture that was always criticized. They were always criticized what was happening, but always, same with elections. Elections were criticized because of the way the practical matters, and the revolutions were also criticized. But then, nevertheless, they had a role there. They had a place. And in terms of what my interest in, of the interest in the people and the relationship between people and government, there were a key place for the inclusion in politics, because so much so that in some countries where there was restrictions to, in some cases, to the franchise, these restrictions were, like Chile, for example, these were completely overlooked when someone belonged to the militia. Yeah. If you were part of the militia, then you could vote, period. Whether you were literate or not literate, whether you had money or not have money, it doesn't matter. You could vote because you were a citizen. You were a citizen in arms. So the institution plays a role. Revolutions have a legitimate place, although they were always criticized. And in the end, this gives part of the this reinforces some tendencies toward instability that are obvious in the case of most countries of Latin America. But they're not, because their reaction against, they're not something that, a reaction against modernity. Some people have explained this of the caudillos being against modernity and revolutions being against, no. They're part of it. Part of it.
Well,
Okay, that's a great thing. Go ahead, Robert.
yeah, I just wanted to say thank you very much. That's a great way to conclude our discussion today. And if everyone wants who's still here to unmute,
Yeah.
let's go ahead and give Professor Sabato a round of applause. Thank you very much for taking the time today to talk with us and converse with us about this fantastic book. And those who haven't read it, I encourage you to definitely try to secure a copy and enjoy this great book. Thank you very much, Professor Sabato.
I thank you all, and I really enjoyed the talk and the questions, and I wish we could go on, but well, it's late here. It's getting dark, as you can see.
I can tell through your window. It's getting dark in Buenos Aires. Right
Okay,
now.
well, thank you, Hilda. I'm going to turn this. I'm going to pause the recording, but then anybody wants to chat for a while, we can do that.